Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about oil changes. So, pretty simple procedure. Not too many tools required to do this, but it's pretty straightforward. It's something that you can do at home. So, we're going to be working today on a 2004 Chevy Silverado, and this is the stuff that you need. Not too complicated. You're going to need an oil filter that's recommended for the vehicle, and the proper amount of oil. And then the oil itself is actually going to have a specific rating that we'll get to in a minute. This truck is also going to require a 15mm wrench for the drain plug. And then you have two different options for oil filter wrenches to get the filter off. And then a funnel. Really nothing too complicated about it. It's pretty straightforward. And let's get to it. So first things first, you kind of want to know what you're looking at and kind of the initial quality of engine oil that's in it. Typically you want to go between 3,000 and 5,000 miles between oil change intervals. In some aspects there are other manufacturers that may recommend 10 or 12 or 14,000 miles, but you really want to look at your service manual, which is part of your owner's manual in the glove box, to see what they recommend. So two things right here so that you can kind of see. This one piece right here on top of the engine, it's got a little picture of an oil can on it. It says SAE 5W30. That's actually the oil fill. So this is where you'd put oil in. So to make the process a little simpler for draining the oil, if you take the cap off, it allows for the oil to drain a little bit quicker coming out of the drain pan. And then typically what I do is I just take it and I'll put it right here, right where the hood latch goes, so that if you try to close the hood and it's there, it reminds you that you didn't add oil into it. Then another aspect right here is the dipstick. So you'll notice that there's actually two different ones. There's a yellow one here, which is for engine oil, and most vehicles, not all nowadays, a lot of newer cars don't have them. There's a dipstick here in the red, and that is actually for the transmission oil. We'll get to that in a later segment. But to read this, it's pretty simple. So this is what they call a dipstick, and how it works is you literally take it, you dip it in, and when you pull it out, it will give you a reading of what oil's in it. So first things first, so you can kind of clean it off and see what you're working with. So on top of here you'll see that there's 5 different dots inside there that have been punched through. And what those are is that is the indication of level. So the very bottom one, closest to the end of the stick, that's going to be your low mark. In between there is going to be your filled, or kind of like in the safe running zone, and then the very top mark is going to be your full mark. So as long as the engine oil is kind of within that range, you should be okay. And that being said, to check the oil, you have to make sure that the vehicle is off and it hasn't been running for a little while. So usually if you let it sit for a couple minutes, 5 minutes or so, you can go through and check the level. So we just clean that dipstick off, take it out, put it back in, and when you pull it up, it'll actually give you a reading. So on there you can see that the oil is on the stick, and a good rule of thumb is always flip it over. Check both sides, and do yourselves a favor, always go with the lowest reading. The thing too is you want to make sure that you have the dipstick pointed down so that the oil is running down the stick and not up the stick. So when it runs up the stick, you get an incorrect reading. So the oil level on this is actually a little low. It's below that safe running zone, and the color itself actually isn't too bad. Typically the engine oil color, you want it to be about a honey color. Once it starts getting darker brown or black, it's usually an indication of contaminants in the oil, and it may be time to change it. But usually go off of what the manufacturer is recommending for mileage and move on from there. So with this oil cap, what that's showing is the type of oil. So you see those letters there, it says SAE 5W30. What that is that's the Society of Automotive Engineering, and it's a 5W30 weight oil. So what that means is that is a blended oil where it's got dual weights to it. And to break it down to the simplest fashion is that The 5W stands for the thickness of the oil when it's cold out. And the 30 is the thickness of the oil when the engine's at operating temperature. So it allows for this oil to change its thickness depending on temperature. So really cold conditions, the oil is a little bit thinner, so it can go through and lubricate the engine quickly. And when the engine is up to operating temperature or warm, the engine oil will actually thicken up a little bit so that it can fill the areas in between all the moving components and make sure that you have a proper liquid film for the engine parts to rotate on. So you want to make sure that you get yourself a good quality oil, and there's things that you have to kind of look for. So on this oil bottle, you'll see that there's actually a little starburst on there, and it says made for gasoline engines. If this was a diesel engine, it's something that you would make sure that you have something for diesel engines. But then also on the back here, it says API, so that's Automotive Petroleum Institute. So that's a service rating for it, so it just makes sure that this oil is appropriate for what your engine's requiring. Like I said before, the owner's manual, if you still have it in most vehicles, if you look in the back, it'll have a area for fluids and specifications, and it will tell you in there. Sometimes it will give you like a manufacturer code number, and you can kind of cross-reference that and figure out what you need. But a lot of the time, you'll look right on the cap, it'll tell you the type of oil that it needs. So right here, it's 5W30. So we're just making sure that we have stuff that matches it. Now this truck in particular takes 6.5 quarts. So this right here, this is a 1 quart container. You can get it in gallon jugs, but you just want to make sure. So that's 1 US quart right there on the bottom. And what's nice about these is that they actually have on the side of the bottle, you see this white stripe that's here. This is actually a see-through stripe, so that it helps you with measuring out. So if I wanted to measure out that 1/2 quart or whatnot, I can pour it out and then I can look through the side of it and I can get an appropriate reading for what we need. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to put this vehicle up in the air, and we're going to get to the business end of it. Alright, so with the vehicle in the air, you're going to need one of 2 different types of drain buckets. So this one right here, this is something you may have at home, and you can pick up easily at any kind of local parts store, or like a Walmart or something along those lines. Or you can have like what typically a shop would have, is a stand-up drain bucket. And what that's going to be for is that's going to be for the used oil that's coming out of the engine. So underneath here, if you look under, there's a couple things you want to just kind of keep in mind. Is that this one white piece right here, this is what we call an oil filter. So that's what the oil passes through and gets screened by to remove any larger particulates so that they don't get pumped through the engine. And then down below it, you can see right here, this is our drain plug. The only thing with these vehicles you got to be really careful with is this piece right here. So this is your exhaust. Typically in a car that's been running for a long period of time, that is going to be extremely hot. So you just want to make sure that you're let it cool off a little bit. So before you start the drain process on this, you just want to make sure that you run the vehicle for a couple minutes just to get the thing warmed up. So when you warm it up, it allows the oil to come out a little bit quicker, but it also allows for any other sediments that have settled at like the top of the engine or whatnot to get kind of pumped out, and they're in the fresh oil so that you can get the thing drained out. So little combination wrench right here, 15mm is the size for this truck. So I'm just going to put it on and I'm just going to give this thing a little push. You don't have to go crazy. Being in the industry, you see people all the time, they crank this thing on there as hard as they can. It's probably not a good practice to do that. So you want to just make sure that you're tighten it to the proper torque specification. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to back this thing out to the point where it's going to start to get loose and it's going to start to drip. And then if you give this thing a quick pull, the fluid will start to drain. And you just have to be mindful of bucket placement to make sure that when this fluid starts to come past this exhaust pipe, it doesn't come shooting off into the floor. And just be kind of mindful of what's going on. So it usually takes between 1 to 2 minutes for the oil to drain out of it, and then you should be okay to kind of move on from there. So first thing that I want to look at here while it's draining is my drain plug. So this piece right here is what's designed to seal the oil. So if you look on the bottom of it, that black ring is actually a sealant ring. It's not sealed by the threads. So some people think that the threads seal it, but it doesn't. The only type of thread that would do that would be called a pipe thread. So it's got a little rubber seal there on this style. Some will have like a brass washer, an aluminum washer, and 9 times out of 10 they'll probably be okay and you can reuse it. But if it's worn out, what you want to do is replace it. Alright, so with the engine oil draining, now is a good time to come up and take the oil filter off. So this right here, this is called an oil filter wrench. The way it works is when you tighten, it'll start to get smaller and it will wrap around the filter. So you can take this up, put it onto the filter itself, and then all you're going to do is try to go counterclockwise to loosen this off. Once you get it kind of broken free, it should come off by hand. The other thing about this is it does make a mess. So you make sure your kind of eye is on that drain bucket. So once this thing starts to drain down, you can kind of come up and take this thing and spin it off the rest of the way. Once you get the filter off, you just want to make sure that you take it, flip it so it's the inlet is facing down inside the drain bucket. And what that would allow for this filter to do is it'll allow for it to drain. And then what we're going to do is we're going to come up and we're going to clean all of this oil that is on everything. So oil on the exhaust is flammable, and then just kind of oil that gets around, it can make a smell and it can burn. And it's something that you want to make sure that you pay attention to and clean off pretty well so that you don't have any comebacks with customers. Alright, so I'm just going to use a little bit of a aerosol cleaner, and I'm just going to spray right around where everything is kind of coated with oil, and to make sure that we get any of the oil off that could be potential to catch fire or cause a burning smell or even drip into somebody's driveway. So once you kind of get it washed off, you can take a rag and you can wipe the thing down. And just make sure you spend the time and do it right, so that there isn't any residue on stuff. So if there's a residue, it's bound to make some type of odor for a customer. Alright, so now that the old oil filter is off, we're ready to install the new one. So first things first is I always make sure that I clean this drain plug off. I inspect that washer with an O-ring and make sure that it's still soft and malleable, which this one is. It's got a little bit of a push or a squeeze to it, and if it was like a brass or an aluminum one, you probably want to end up replacing that. And then what we're going to do is fill this oil filter with some fresh oil. So there's a little plastic cover on top of them, and what you want to do is take a little bit of fresh oil and you're just going to pour it right inside. And what that's going to do is that's going to do what we call priming the filter, so that there is no delay in oil pressure. So a little bit of this oil on the top here, I'm going to take it and I'm just going to just wipe around this O-ring. So this O-ring up here is what actually seals the oil filter. And you go, why am I putting oil on it? And why I do that is to allow this to properly seat itself. So when you spin this up and in, it has to come to a point where it's going to stop against the engine block, and then you're going to have to turn it about 1/2 to 3/4 of a turn more so that it will stay in place. But what it also does is it also helps with taking the filter off later down the line, because a little bit of lubrication doesn't allow for that seal to really stick too hard to the block. So putting this thing up inside the car, it's not too hard. What I've already done is I've wiped down where that area was where the filter goes, and just be careful and make sure that you're not sticking this inside some dirt or anything. I'm just going to put this up here, and I'm going to hold it with my thumb, put a little pressure, and then I'm going to spin it right here. I'm going to spin it with my finger, and it's going to allow this to kind of go into place, and it should go up 4, 5, 6 revolutions easily, and then it's going to come up to a point where it stops against the block, and I'm going to take it and I'm going to turn this about 1/2 to 3/4 more of a turn. And once that's done, you just want to come up and wipe the filter off, wipe off where any marks are that you put any oil with your hands, and then what we'll do is we'll install this drain plug. So the drain plug, very simple. You get your plug, you get your wrench, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put this in by hand. That's a big key factor here, is we've got a steel bolt going into an aluminum oil pan. So the steel's a lot harder than the aluminum, so you want to be kind of careful. So I'm just going to take it and spin it in by hand till it stops, and then I'm going to come here and I'm going to just snug it up. You don't have to hang off it, just give it a little snug so it's in place. So once it's tight, again, I'm just going to go through, I'm going to make sure that I wipe off any residual oil, make sure there's nothing kind of dripping, and then we'll be able to lower the car down and start the refill procedure. Alright, so with the vehicle down, next thing that you want to grab is a good funnel. I've seen plenty of people in the industry over the years, they try not to use a funnel because they don't want to waste the time cleaning one and putting one in. And then they try to pour the oil in, and they pour the oil all over the engine. So do yourselves a favor, use a funnel. It's not too hard, it's a nice tool, works perfect. So just make sure you wipe it out so it's nice and clean. And we're going to install the new oil. Not too difficult, but there is a little trick to putting the oil in from the bottle. So if you want to make this go quicker, it's very simple. All you have to do is pour the bottle with the opening on the top side, and allows for the oil to flow out pretty smoothly. If you kind of give this thing a nice gentle pour, it'll come out pretty easily, so it won't sit there and kind of glug its way in. So you can kind of pick up some time making sure you're doing it right. So I'm just going to sit that there and let that drain for a second while I get the other ones. So we're going to put 6 quarts into this thing to start, and then we're going to check the level. So let me put those in real quick and check in a second. Alright, so now that we have the 6 quarts of oil installed and the oil filter has been primed, what we're going to do is check the level before we even start the engine. So I'm going to take the dipstick once again, make sure that I insert it into the dipstick tube. I want to make sure that I push it all the way down so it seats. I'll pull it out. It will give me a reading. So I'm just going to hold this down a little bit, and you can see, I can get the light a little bit on it, right? That the oil level is actually right about here. It's a little above where it should be. But what that is that's actually the overflow of oil that's going to be going into the oil filter. So it'll always be up a little bit higher than what you would anticipate right off the bat. But you can tell the oil looks nice and clean. And then what we're going to do is make sure that we put the dipstick back in the tube, and we have to make sure that we put the oil cap on before we even start the engine. So this should go on. Some of them will spin in a few times. This one is just about a half turn where it goes on and then it stops. The engine oil system is actually what they call a sealed system, and this is part of the upper part of the valve cover, and it goes to what they call the positive crankcase ventilation. So if you had this cap off, A, it's probably going to spit out a little bit of oil, but B, it's going to allow the engine not to run properly. Some cars that are out there, some of the German manufactured cars, if you take an oil cap off or you take a dipstick out, they don't run well at all. So just make sure that you have those reinstalled, and then all you're going to do is going to go over and we're going to start the vehicle, We're going to let it run for about a minute or so. We're going to make sure that the oil pressure gauge comes up and that there's oil on it. And then from there, we'll just ensure that there's no leaks. So we'll just kind of poke in here. I'm going to reach in. And what you guys see, it's an oil pressure gauge there. The vehicle started. See how the gauge comes. And the oil level comes up. The pressure is right there, right around 40 psi. So it's this top gauge right here. It's got the same thing. It's got a little picture of that little oil can on it. And I'll do now is I'll shut it off, and we'll come back out, and we're just going to check underneath the vehicle and make sure that there's no leaks. Sometimes those oil filters could leak if it was improperly installed, or the drain plug, or you may have a leaking oil line or something along those lines, but just make sure you do that. And then what we'll do is we'll let this sit for a minute or so. We'll recheck the level, and the level should be at their appropriate height. Alright, so the car's been sitting for a few minutes now, and just to check the oil level, now you can kind of see where the level's at. So the oil level itself is right up to the top part of this line, right here on both sides. So it's right on the money. If it was a little bit low, then you top off the rest of the way to make sure that the oil level's at the right height. And if it was a little overfilled, then you would have to kind of go down underneath the vehicle and drain some out by that drain plug. And another thing to kind of keep in mind is some of these vehicles will actually have an oil service reminder light. And this vehicle does. It has a little warning that comes up on the instrument pack and tells you to change the oil. So let's go inside and I'll show you how to reset that. Alright, so if you turn the key on and I start it, you're going to see that this instrument pack down here, so it says change engine oil. That's a service reminder. So that's done based off of mileage. Some vehicles do it off of mileage and time. So a lot of your newer cars will actually do that. So say you had a vehicle that sat for a few months, it may come up saying that it needs an oil change. To reset it on the GM vehicles, it's not too hard. Turn the key off, and then you're going to turn the key 2 clicks forward, so it's the accessory position. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to take my foot down on the gas pedal, and I'm going to put the gas pedal down to the floor and off. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And what that will do is that will say oil life reset. Other manufacturers have different ways of doing it, and you can usually look that up on how to do it per vehicle, or it may even be in the service manual. That's pretty much it. Oil changes aren't too hard. It's one of those things that if you do it yourself, you can save some money, but it's also a great entry-level task to be able to do when you're trying to get your foot in the door working in a facility. For the most part, oil changes are going to be the same for most vehicles. There's going to be a couple different things that change here and there, but overall, the job is essentially the same. You're draining the oil, putting the oil in it, and you're replacing the filters. There are other tasks that are usually associated with it if you're doing a regular service on a car, but we're going to get deeper into that in some other segments. So if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and leave me some comments. Thanks so much. Bye.